Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wazadome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest, somebody I've been wanting to have on for a while. Today's guest is Dr. Joshua Meyers, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Howard University. He's also the author of Black Studies, of Black Study, Cedric Robinson, The Time of Black Radical Tradition, and We Are Worth Fighting For, a history of the 1989 Howard student protests. His work centers around Black intellectual traditions, philosophy, music, foodways, and the politics of education. Dr. Meyers, again, thank you for coming through and spending some time with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before we even kind of get started on, some of the history of Black studies, the politics of Black studies, where we are with Black studies now, what inspired you to write of Black study?
Ah, man. So a lot of it was stemming from my time as an undergrad at Howard University, studying under Greg Carr,
Mm,
who was the chair, or who became the chair soon after I graduated, um, and it eventually brought me back to be a professor after I went to Temple for grad school. And during that time, we talked a lot about this concept that he was working out called disciplinary Africana studies. And what that means is what would it mean for Africana studies to have its own methodology, its own tradition, genealogy, or way of studying.
hmm
And that conversation was, of course, one of the linchpins for why Temple University was able to argue for its own department or arguing for its own PhD program
Yeah, with the
back in
Malefic Santi,
1988
right?
under Malefic Santi,
Mhm.
right? But it's one thing to make that argument, and it's a wholly another thing to actually do it.
Mhm.
And so by the time I got to graduate school, that was just foremost on my mind. What does it mean to really do this, to really accomplish this? And it led me to the world of exploring the concept of disciplines themselves. And so if we're
Mhm.
talking about disciplinary Africana studies, then what is a discipline? What does a discipline do? And I spent about 2 years really exploring that particular question. And then I landed on something which was, well, how did other Black scholars explore this question?
Mhm.
Because one of the things that we see is that when Black PhD holders enter into their own disciplines, they are struggling, they're fighting.
Well,
And they're not fighting just because it's a question of diversity.
right.
They're fighting over the terms of intellectual and engagement.
Mm,
How do you wage that kind of war?
right.
And so this was a consistent thing. But when we study Black intellectual history, we usually categorize it in many different ways, maybe political categories, or we say that these people were radical, these people were not, or we say that these people were pioneers by being the first to do this or that, so on and so forth, right?
hmm
But we never start with, well, how did they understand what the hell history was?
Right.
Or
Right.
how did they understand what sociology was?
hmm
Or how did they understand the nature of philosophy, the nature of religion, the nature of political science, the nature of the humanities?
hmm
But they were all doing that
Right.
in their
Right.
own ways. And
Right.
so I landed on these particular people because I wanted to have that broad conversation, but cloak it in biography,
Mm,
cloak it in story, cloak
right.
it in familiar people for some and new
hmm
people for others.
hmm
So it's by taking biography, and this is something that I learned by writing the biography of Cedric Robinson, we can have conversations that are not just about the person's life. We can have conversations about these broader questions and broader issues, such as the nature of what a discipline is, or the nature of what Black studies is. And so I pursue that through the four figures, really six figures, but the four primary figures of Du Bois, Wynter, Carruthers, and Robinson.
Yeah. And I that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the work. It's exploring that question and the idea of, disciplines and just whenever we are looking at, uh, you know, different different subjects broken down into these disciplines and
Hmm.
disciplines upon disciplines in a way, is there something that, I mean, is it easier for the powers that be to disregard our intellectual histories or our or where we're even
Hmm.
trying to go by
Hmm.
just by having all these disciplines and everything being so fine tuned to one
Yeah.
specific this one specific area, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's what, disciplinarity tries to do, is to try to make knowledge so regimented, maybe, or make knowledge so specific, or make knowledge so segmented that specialization becomes its own thing.
Yes. Hmm.
And so we don't create the kind of broadly um, interested folk
Right, right, right.
or broadly educated folk. I mean, this
Mhm.
is this is actually playing out right now um, on Facebook, which my students always say that's the old people's social media. So why do you even engage? But there's a demographic of people that take Facebook comments very seriously.
Absolutely. It's some conversations going on in them comments,
Well, right now there's a
man.
conversation about academic jargon,
Hmm.
and whether academic jargon can ever serve the purpose of broadly disseminating knowledge for
Hmm.
our people. And I'm not going to get into the debate, but what's interesting about the debate is people come from their own disciplinary traditions to engage that debate. And
Yeah.
sometimes they don't even know that's what they're doing.
Right, right.
So that question looks very different from someone who's trained very narrowly as a philosopher versus someone who's trained very narrowly as a historian,
Mm.
right? And so part of what disciplines do is create these strands, really stratification of knowledge in a way that prevents us from being able to see,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's not an accident of disciplines. This was done because those particular areas of knowledge serve very specific political purposes within the context of empire.
Right,
And so you
right.
needed people to focus on one thing. So this serves this purpose that we all have, right? And think about the control of higher education by capital and how
Mhm.
that feeds into the Industrial Revolution and
Yeah.
all of the things that come out of that. The disciplines are birthed at the same time, and their racial ontologies, if you will, are actually a product of
Mm.
colonial regimes.
Absolutely.
And having to say that is one thing, but then having to show that even your methodology that you think is neutral is rooted in that is another thing. And so we have to be able to have those conversations so people don't kind of accept that the disciplines came out of thin air and they are just neutral tools that we use to study
Mm.
reality, when in fact, these are tools of empire.
Indeed, indeed. And in a sense, it keeps you from seeing the larger picture, the interconnectedness of things,
Yeah.
and how things relate to each other. And for
Hmm.
many people, especially, people who may not be, um, just who may not always be what you would consider a scholar or someone that's in the academy.
Right.
This is still, the what Black studies, in essence, what we think about its use when we look at San
Hmm.
Francisco State and the Panthers and
Hmm.
Cornell. It wasn't just hey, we're going to learn some Black history here.
Right.
These are political movements that are
Hmm.
uh, playing its part in trying to free and liberate us from these oppressive systems. And
Hmm.
we're definitely going to get into more of that. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, again, when it comes to Black studies emerging out of these radical demands,
Hmm.
Black students at San Francisco State, Cornell,
Hmm.
you have figures like Dr. Nathan Hare,
Hmm.
and all of these different and even anti-war protests that were happening
Absolutely.
on college campuses everywhere. Uh, a lot of the push for Black studies programs were shaped by Black nationalism,
Hmm.
Pan-Africanism, Third
Hmm.
World liberation. Where
Hmm.
we are now in 2025, do you feel like Black studies as a field has drifted away from those revolutionary beginnings? And if so, what do you think has been lost or gained in that shift?
I mean, it's increasingly hard to say what Black studies as a field is
Mm,
in this moment, right?
mm,
Because we are so fragmented in terms of types of universities that we teach at, types of units within those universities. And the major question, I think, is how do we deal with graduate training in the discipline?
yeah.
Because part of the thrust, if you go all the way back to Harris and other folks from that era, was to create folk or to cultivate folk who were going to be the intellectual thrust of the liberation struggle.
Hmm.
Like that's what it was for. But in order to stay in the university as a unit, you then had to replicate the form of higher education. The question becomes, can we do both things at the same
Mm.
time? And so, to your question, the real question is, do we still ask that question? That means,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
in other
yeah.
words, are people even thinking about the
Hmm.
contradiction?
Hmm.
And I think that some people are. I think many
Yeah,
people are at least focused on, getting a handle on the role that we might play in ongoing movements around the world. And what do you do in the classroom in
mm,
light of that? How
mm,
do you engage the classroom in light of that? I think also we have to be very clear, and that's kind of why I opened the book the way I opened it,
yeah,
about how some people have entered into these spaces and tried to silence those conversations, even if it wasn't intentional, by
mm,
way of the kind of cloaking themselves within the garment of the Western Academy and being happy to be invited to the table.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And so
yeah.
that happened. And I mean, we have to talk about that, the ways that that happened into the 1980s and the 1990s, what some people call the institutionalization phase of Black studies. No, in fact, institutionalization and disciplinarity are kind of like hand in hand.
Yeah, yeah.
This is why Sylvia writes the notion of mistaking the map for the territory.
Mm,
And so, to the extent that we've become like the academy, then it's hard to say that we can be the intellectual wing of the liberation struggle. But also, to the extent that we don't even raise that contradiction,
yeah,
becomes a referendum on what we are actually doing. And I would say that the most promising, I would say, conversations around this are happening among young, young graduate students. So people who are early in their programs. And this is one of the things that I've learned um, really as I'm going around the country. I'm talking to them with this book, and they're saying that this is what we were kind of wanting and hoping our graduate programs would help open the
yeah,
door intellectually for us around these particular questions. And I think that that's promising because they at least know that there is something off
yeah.
about the nature of graduate education across the board, but certainly in Black studies. And they're trying to think about what it might we do differently. And
Hmm.
I think the test over the next decade will be, what do those students do in light of that feeling, in light of that sensibility, in light of that recognition? Will they be able to shape the next generation of Black studies students? And so one thing that is like super technical,
Hmm.
but is really important in terms of like the structure of higher education that we struggle with is, if we're going to be here, and I think most people will say, at least for now, we should stay. But if we're going to be here, then the people who are getting these advanced degrees in Black studies should probably be the ones who are teaching Black studies to the next generation.
Right.
But guess what, brother? They don't
What?
necessarily hire Black studies PhDs in Black studies programs.
Wow. Wow,
And so this is
that seems so counterintuitive, man. Like,
so this is the thing, and this is the
hmm.
thing, and our students are recognizing this, and it's been changed. It's shifted a bit in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, but for a while it was a dearth, right? And so at Howard, I forget, I lost count, but the majority, only, let me count, one, two, three, four, five, six of us
Hmm.
have PhDs in Africana studies,
Wow.
which is like some kind of record.
Right.
So yeah,
And
that's not the case in most Black studies units, and so that's a real thing that we have to struggle with. And it's one of those things, right? Institutionalization means, all right, we can create our own PhDs now.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
what does that mean politically,
Hmm.
and what does that mean in terms of their sensibility and relationship to the academy? We hope that if they learn Black studies, that means that they would have a relationship to the ongoing struggles on the ground.
That is wow. My mind's kind of blown because
Yeah.
but I never put that two and two together because at this point, the only place you can get a PhD in Black Studies is Temple, right?
No, no, no.
Oh,
We have
no,
quite a
there's,
few places.
oh, is it? Okay,
Yeah, we have
okay,
quite a few
okay.
places,
All right.
maybe just shy of 20
Oh,
institutions.
okay, okay, okay.
But
Hmm.
Temple waged the question of disciplinarity in ways that other places did not. And
Okay.
so it's that really complicated question around how do you relate to the concept of Afrocentricity that then pushes others to say, well, we don't necessarily buy into it. So they created alternatives, right?
Mm.
And so as that's happening, these are people who may be Marxists, who may be progressive, liberal, but they are saying that there's still a value to the study of Black life.
Yeah.
And then the Ivies catch on.
Hmm.
And so if you look at this in terms of trajectories, like 1988 is
Hmm.
Temple, 1995 is UMass Amherst. This is like John Bracey and this very strict kind of content-based, movement-based application of learning to the people, right? That's 1995. 1997 is Berkeley out in the
Mm.
Bay Area,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
So you still, and there's a Marxist diaspora bent, right?
Hmm.
Many scholars from the Caribbean, for instance, right? By 2000, Yale and Harvard come knocking.
Mm.
So this is Henry Gates and them, right?
Yeah, that's what I was
Other,
gonna yeah,
and so
yeah.
like
The
once that happens, in fact, Yale, with all due respect, they didn't believe that Black Studies PhD could stand alone. So in order to get into Yale's program, you have to get into the English PhD program too, and the history
wow.
program, or the history, or the right.
Wow.
And so
Wow.
this changes the whole question and trajectory. And so since then, we've had several institutions develop PhD programs, and it's a mixture of all of it, right? And
Okay.
so um, I would
And
say
but
that
many of those PhD students aren't the ones that are getting these
for
professor jobs.
for a minute that was the case, right? And
Wow.
so they would create PhD programs and then not hire their students. Because you also have to remember that there's another narrative out there about hireability,
Mm.
and brilliant Black intellectuals in the 1990s and the early 2000s were being told that it's okay to study Black studies, but don't get your degree in it because you can't be hired,
Right.
right? Or you
Right.
won't be hired. And
Right.
so you have, people who are going into comparative literature and anthropology and they're doing brilliant work
Hmm.
around Black stuff or Black content, but
Hmm.
it's not generated around the disciplinary questions that we are talking about in Black studies. And because they're brilliant, they're attracted to a school and they can
Hmm.
then teach the Intro to Black Studies course. And then you might get part of the narrative, but you won't get
Get
the
the whole.
disciplinary narrative, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the other thing that I want to mention for people, for the viewers, is that we try to deal with this really at the outset. So there's a sister named Bertha Maxwell,
Mm.
and Bertha Maxwell is a really incredible visionary, who was down at University of North Carolina, Charlotte,
Okay.
and she essentially said, "Look, all the debates you men are having
Mm.
around Marxism, nationalism, that's all well and good, but we need to be organized." And so
Mm.
she was the person that's behind the National Council for Black Studies. And when
Okay.
the National Council of Black Studies was created, um, one of the major thrusts was we got to come to some consensus or standardization about what we do.
Right. Right.
And so we're not saying that everybody has to think the same, but we are saying that Black studies should mean something when it comes to what all students are getting. That was a important battle that was
Who
waged in
who
the
is who
1970s and
decide
80s.
who decides what that would look
Yeah,
like?
right. But that battle was resolved in a way that did not lead to each program adopting that curriculum. And that's why I
Mm.
said at the beginning of your question, it's hard to say
Yeah.
what Black
Yeah.
studies is, because of this variation that exists now.
Is is that the same? I mean, are when it comes to other degree programs, as far as especially PhD programs, is this only the case with Black Studies where we are kind of in a
Mm-mm.
situation? Okay, okay, so it's a
No. So yeah, I think, and that's part of why some people say it's not a huge deal
got you.
to be diverse in terms of our
Hmm.
approaches, right?
Hmm.
And so let me just give you a quick example. Um, you go to get a PhD in, say, history, and your focus is the continent of Africa, right?
Hmm.
You're not just going to go to the program that's convenient to you
Hmm.
geographically, for instance, because
Right, right.
I want to be. No, you're going to go to Michigan State or you're going to go to Northwestern. Why? Because they have very specific people or
Mm.
archives or approaches that lend itself to the study of Africa, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the idea is everybody doesn't have to be specializing in the study of Africa if you're a historian. You just go to the places where that's done. The
Mm,
problem with that is it's not applicable to Black studies in the same way because we have fewer programs, number one.
yeah.
Number two, we have a different mandate.
Right. 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 Right.
And
Right.
so
Right.
this
Right.
notion,
Absolutely.
this notion that you can just follow your intellectual curiosity and let that be the metric. No, the metric is liberation.
Yeah.
How are we going to free ourselves? And
Hmm.
what do we need to do in each of these programs to ensure that we're on the same page? If
Absolutely.
that's the question, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we study and how we study is absolutely critical to clarifying that for each of these formations and for Black studies itself. So we have to have, I don't like the word standardization, but we have to have some level of commonality, some community,
Hmm.
um, some orientation that is held in common that ensures that that thrust never goes away. We can disagree, but that thrust has to be the same. This is Bertrand Maxwell's point. That thrust has to be there. We all know what we're doing this for. There's no
Yeah.
confusion about that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so, yeah.
yeah. That's important, very important. I appreciate you for clarifying that as well. As far as your book of Black Study, chapters, there's a chapter on Du Bois, Sylvia Wynter, Jacob
Hmm.
Carruthers, and Cedric Robinson.
Hmm.
Again, all towering figures within the Black intellectual tradition. What inspired you to write about these amazing thinkers within our tradition?
Oh man, it's all personal stories are attached to all of them, right?
Mhm.
But in general, what holds them together is the suspicion around Western thought
Yes.
and its capacity to really frame our lives and frame our realities and frame our experiences and frame our future,
Hmm.
right? They all say no to that question, right?
Right.
So that's big.
Hmm.
That's big because every Black scholar doesn't say no to
Hmm.
that question. Every Black scholar in Black studies or in a Black studies unit,
Hmm.
right? Going back to that question of like, are you doing Black studies if you're in Black studies?
Hmm.
But everybody doesn't say no to that question.
Hmm.
But saying no to that question is huge.
Right.
It's huge because it then opens up a whole field of possibility.
Mm.
All right, so the answer to the question of Western thought is no. Then what will get us to ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, in order of the book, like Du Bois is there because I was really tired of him being used for other purposes than what I just described.
Mm. Mm.
So there's this way that Du Bois becomes a diversity project for people,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
But Du Bois was doing so much more than that. He was not just trying to ask for a seat at their table. He was trying to really rethink the table at first and then maybe overthrow it. And part of his route towards that is a really deep engagement with philosophy of science,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
And with Africa. Like
Yes.
Du Bois in Africa does not register for most people.
Mm.
When you think about his engagement with the continent, his engagement with African history, but
Hmm.
also African culture.
Right.
And
Right.
there's a reason that he goes to Ghana at the end of his life. It's not just something that he decided on a whim. Like Du Bois is thinking about Africa at the very beginning.
Yes. Yes.
Like the whole color line question. Anytime you see him write about that, right? He's thinking about the whole African diaspora, not just blackness in America.
Hmm.
And so that's really important to contextualize. And so I thought it was necessary for me to talk about Du Bois, and then Winter and Carruthers and Robinson. It was like that next generation.
Yeah.
Like, did they listen to Du Bois, right?
Hmm.
And each of them has a very complicated relationship to Du Bois.
Hmm.
Sometimes disagreement with him, but this notion of, all right, what then do we do once that field is open to us? And what Winter says is that we have an actual way to discern what humanity is without the crutch of having to root it through white maleness.
Right.
That's a huge thing.
Absolutely.
Right? That's a
Absolutely.
huge thing. And so the reason she can do that though is like she's from
Caribbean.
Jamaica
Yeah.
and she went to
Hmm.
like places where magic happened and she went to places where dance was happening and she went to places where music was happening and it's the cultural logic of black folk that gave her a window into the terms of their humanity. And folks who don't see that are the ones who don't understand why Aretha Franklin sounds like she does or why Coltrane sounds like he does and how that means something to black people who have no idea what the word sociology means.
Right. Right. Wow. True indeed.
So
A couple years ago, a good friend of mine introduced me to Winter and sent me No Humans Involved, and
Hmm.
um, like the first time I read it, I was like, I don't even know if I understand it, right?
Hmm.
it's tough, right? And so
Hmm.
it's something that I had to, and just keep reading and try to pick
Yeah.
apart. And it's, I mean, brilliant, obviously. But Winter in particular, doesn't, in my opinion, always get the credit that she deserves, right?
Hmm.
That could be said about all of those thinkers in the
Sure.
book, and pretty much the thinkers within our Black radical tradition. Period.
Hmm.
I kind of wanted to
Hmm.
focus on Winter. What was for you? What was about Winter and the importance of her scholarship,
Yeah.
what she contributes to our intellectual tradition.
I actually came to her later than the others, right? I came
Mm,
to her after my dissertation.
mm,
It's actually, Wilbert Roget, who's scholar of French at Temple University, who came to my defense. Wasn't in my committee, I didn't even know him well. Where he's like, I'm coming to the defense. And he asked a question at my defense, and he said, where's Sylvia Wynter in this? And I'm like,
mm,
I don't know. I couldn't answer the question. And so I actually spent the next summer really reading her, and I had the same experience you had. Everybody would
mm.
have that experience. This is the
Yeah.
nature of the
Okay.
way that she approaches the word.
Right. Right.
And I think it's driven by several things, but one of the things it's driven by is you have to pay your dues to understand the blues.
Yeah, 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 absolutely,
So I mean, and
absolutely.
she actually says that
Muddy Waters would agree.
she says that in Black Metamorphosis, and it's like, yeah, this is like blues.
Mm,
You don't expect to walk into a Black church and go straight to the organ and understand everything that's
mm,
happening.
mm,
So this
mm,
notion that
mm,
everything should be self-evident, right?
mm.
But her work is like uncovering so many different layers that it shouldn't be self-evident.
Right, right.
Right. I think that's the beauty of engaging her at the level that we engage her. But you also, this came up in Brooklyn with Allegra and I earlier last month in May. There's also like going beyond where people start with her,
Mm,
meaning going to the plays that she wrote,
mm,
going to the novel that she wrote,
mm.
going to her like dealing with like Caribbean culture at mid-century,
Right,
right?
right.
Because so much power. And it's like this is the thing that animates George Lamming. This is the thing that animates even Amy Césaire. In fact, all of them, right? And they then translate that into political struggle in ways that are responsible for a lot of the intellectual political movements that really dominate the scene that eventually eventuates into everything from Rastafari to the Grenadian Revolution, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the power of like engaging her at that point because she's
Mm,
in many ways touching all of that too. And that then shows why the rigor in her writing has to go to the next level by the
yeah,
80s and 90s.
right,
And so
right.
yeah, like Winter is a I mean, I always say that you have to commit yourself to a lifetime of studying Winter. And that's where I think we have to be with most of our scholars. And so Carruthers is similar in the sense that Carruthers argued that look, some of us are going to have to do the very slow and patient work too.
Yes.
And he's doing that in the middle of Chicago, South Side
Mm,
Chicago, where it's like, all right, we got to do a stop the violence. We got to do a meal drive. People are hungry, and he's like, yes, we are.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And some of us got to do the slow and patient work.
Right,
And so he
right.
kind of devotes his not kind of he devotes his life to like, what does Africa have to do with Southside Chicago in
Mm-hmm.
a way that is not naive about the real issues that our folks are facing because he's absolutely engaged in every element of Black nationalist political struggle in Chicago. And he's also saying the African past has something to offer us too.
Absolutely.
Winter says the same thing. Robinson, of course, argues that we can't negate, and we never negated our African pasts. And this is the thing that allows him to come to political theory on different terms. And so like all of them together is like once you open that space up, we got somewhere to go that's not going to be back to the thing that colonized us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
And yeah, absolutely. And I've recently re-engaged with a lot of Carruthers' work, in particular after
mhm,
reading. uh, Dr. Kamal Rashid's Jacob Carruthers book.
It's my homie.
Yeah, that's my homie too, and the rest,
Yeah,
Jacob Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview. And so yeah, I went through it again. Obviously, again, like you said, this is a lot of this stuff is a lifetime, is a work of a lifetime. We have to,
yeah,
these texts that we read, and reading it once most times is not enough,
yeah,
and so just going through it again with a different pair of eyes, and as we learn more and get older and see things differently,
yeah.
or it's lifelong
I
work.
remember like, so you know how when I don't know if you have any relationship to the church, but you know how when like somebody just gets saved and they're like on
Yeah,
fire.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right,
So like this
right.
tradition has that too. Like when you first get like into like the movement and into history,
Mhm.
and I had it, I have this like holier than thou attitude
Mhm.
towards like other people who are not with me yet,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like what do you like? Why are you still celebrating Thanksgiving, man?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, come on.
yeah, yeah.
And this is like, thankfully, this is before social media, so you can't dig up my old tweets because but it was rough because I mean I was one of these people who were like against Obama in 2008.
Mhm.
Like nobody wanted to hear that,
Yeah.
right?
Oh no,
But
especially then. Oh no, oh no.
yeah,
Nobody wanted to hear that.
yeah.
Mhm.
The reason I raised that is that because I wanted to be like super organizer guy,
Mhm.
I thought that there was like a set number of things that I would have to read to be the best at that,
Right,
right?
right, right.
And so I thought, as long as I get through these texts,
Mhm.
Miseducation of the Negro, Wretched of the
Mhm.
Earth,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. And I thought maybe what 20, 25, 50 at the most, right?
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
many books could there be?
Yeah, 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 right, right.
And so that's what I did. I mean, I was
Mhm.
reading like Harold Cruz, Crisis, all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
Because I thought, all right, there's a limit, and then you're
Mm-mm.
good.
Yeah, no. I thought
I
so
had
too.
to I was quickly humbled.
Hmm.
And I think, the creator for the people that humbled me, right? One of those people is like Haile Gerima, for instance.
Mm.
Like, no, 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 no,
Absolutely.
no. This is long distance, brother. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
no.
yeah. Yeah.
And so I've seen this cycle in a lot of people, and one of the things that I think we have to do a better job of is caring for the people once they make that recognition. Because
Hmm.
I've seen people on fire and then
Hmm.
completely abandoned once they realize I can't be on fire the whole time.
Mm. Right, right,
I
right.
can't sustain that though.
When they
And so
realize
this
it's a
this
marathon, not a sprint.
right.
Hmm.
And so we have to do better about ensuring folks, get initiated into the deep and enduring stuff too, because it's not a limit.
Hmm.
There's always going to be, Ptah Hotep says the limits of one's craft are never reached,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And so this idea that we can like reach a point where we're good and now, no.
Yeah.
So this is constantly growing, constantly evolving, and we have to like Rashida Phillips's book, Time and Space. Think about time and space differently in order to know what cycle we are actually in,
Mm. Right,
right?
right, right,
And
right.
so, yeah, yeah, I think that we should definitely try to get more people into the room, but make sure that they stay in the room is the really the challenge here.
Absolutely, absolutely. That kind of brings up our next question. You mentioned this in the book, but Dr. Greg Carr, says
Hmm.
that the African study of phenomenon and experience got reduced to the study of Black stuff.
Hmm.
Before I've even finished with that part of the question, I just felt like that was a very profound
Yeah.
thought, right? But how do you see this reduction happening within
Hmm.
Black studies? And do you feel that in some
Yeah.
cases Black studies uh, is now no longer engaging with African and diasporic knowledge in a meaningful way? Meaning just like
Yeah.
the collection of Black history facts, and
Right.
like that's because Black studies means so much more.
Right. 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 So yeah, that quote comes from it actually comes from a talk that was converted into an article.
Mm,
So I had the privilege of being at the talk. Like I said earlier, I studied under Carr,
hmm.
and we remain absolutely connected in grad school. And a year into grad school, he came up to New York to do a lecture. I think it was the Donald Smith Distinguished Lecture at Baruch College. Try to make sure I got that right. But he titled his lecture "What Black Studies Is Not,"
Mm, right.
and that was such a powerful moment you know, that he eventually is asked to, uh, put down on paper for the journal Socialism and Democracy, March 2011. If anybody's listening and can't find the article, just hit me up and I'll send you a copy of it because it's so important. But in that quote, that quote comes from a section called "The Crisis and the Question,"
Mm,
and the crisis is essentially because we have been incorporated into the muster of the Western Academy, right? Does it make us less willing to really question, as our ancestors, all of our ancestors questioned, the nature of knowledge itself?
right.
And then out of that question, produce answers that come out of who we actually are.
Mm,
In order to really address that crisis, you got to have a way of doing it or ways of
mm,
doing it.
mhm,
And the disciplines don't get us there. The Western,
mm,
because they're Western disciplines,
right, right,
right? And
right.
so African study and phenomena means really thinking about differently what constitutes study. Like one of the things that I'm so, adamant about and engaging with, for instance, is music, right? Because one of the
Mm,
great intellectual projects that Black people have created over the last 600 years is sound.
mm,
Sound isn't always reducible to the logic of Western thinking.
yeah, right,
And
right,
even trying to do it doesn't work, right?
right, right.
Right. And so the reason why ethnomusicology struggles to really orient us around what Black music is doing is just because it's ethnomusicology.
Mm,
In other
mhm.
words, just say the blues.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know,
Mhm,
like use the concepts and use the words that we created for the sounds, and that gets us to like the difference between the African study of phenomenon and the study of Black stuff, right? How do you understand the blues? You feel it.
right.
The West would say, how do you understand the blues? You try to document it and analyze it.
Right.
See the difference?
Mhm,
That's
yeah.
the study of Black stuff. Going to the Jew joint is Black studies.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Nah, that's something I mean, that's perfectly put. I was even watching that last documentary that came out about Max Roach, and I can't believe whether it was Max Roach or
Yes.
yeah, where he was like, I don't even use the word jazz. That's like calling me the N-word, like, and I was
No.
like, I had to sit
No.
back and like, wow.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting, that the root of what they believed that they were doing, is blues. And that's
yeah,
one of we created that word, whereas outsiders created the word jazz. And that's a very clear, like, set of, political markers that the musicians have placed around this, right?
mhm,
Um, and so one of the litmus tests often of like young musicians is, can you play the blues?
mhm.
Right. But to your point, like Max Roach is so interesting because, he's from Brooklyn, went to
Mhm,
Boys High, like grew up with Randy Weston. This is like a microcosm of the whole African diaspora,
mhm. Right,
right?
right.
He's looking at all of the elders, and these elders are coming from the US South and they're coming from Caribbean and they're coming from the continent. And he's able to like take everything
Mhm,
out of that brew
mhm.
and and not just reduce it to the drum kit, but reduce it to his compositional ethos
Right.
at a time of turmoil.
Mm.
Like this is a perfect expression of what we mean by Black study,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Right.
Because I'm not giving up on the past. I'm not giving up on the possibility that there's something there for me, right?
Hmm.
But I'm also not looking at the past as an archival document. It's a living tradition. It's something that I can inject into me and make me different and change the things around me.
Mm. Right.
This is the brilliance of a Max Roach. And he's not
Hmm.
doing this in a vacuum. He's not an individual genius, but this is still the brilliance of Max Roach.
Absolutely.
And so, interesting enough, so what happens in the 1970s at UMass Amherst is John Bracey and them say, well, these are the people that we want to teach.
Mm.
So Archie Shepp teaches in Black Studies
Wow.
at UMass
Wow.
Amherst, right?
Wow.
Max Roach hangs out up there. Go over to the West Coast. I'm actually doing a piece on this right now. Horace Tapscott, the great pianist, Pan-African People's Orchestra, teaches in Black Studies too. And so it's not to like say that it's only the musicians because it's also the
Yeah.
painters, it's the
Hmm.
dancers, right? It's the novelists and the poets. All of them are in this together.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the contradictions that happens in the 1980s and 90s is these administrators said, you can't have a pianist teaching blacks. Wait a minute, what's their qualification? And so that's when the professionalization and institutionalization starts happening, and we kind of lose the feeling that Max Roach brings to the table. Why?
Right,
Because I have a PhD.
right, right. No, that's deep, man. That's deep. Wow. I didn't even know that about Archie Shepp. I mean,
Yes. I mean, I
yeah.
saw one of his syllabuses, man.
Mhm. What do
I
you
mean,
have on there, man?
I would teach it today.
Wow,
Like really.
wow, wow.
Because you also have to understand that like classical music departments know that they have to get jazz programs to stay relevant too.
Really.
But Archie Shepp didn't go to the jazz program. He went to the Black Studies program. But
Mm.
some of the jazz kids decided, oh my God, Archie Shepp teaches here. Let me go to the Black
Um,
Studies
that's
program.
dope. That's
And
dope.
they thought that they were going to get technical knowledge about how to play. Archie
Nah.
Shepp said, no, we're going to sing spirituals today.
Mm, mm, mm.
And we're going to understand the history of why these spirituals were created. And then
Yeah.
maybe at the end of the semester, I can teach you something about improvisation. But if you don't start with the spirituals, you'll never get why we improvised.
Right. 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 Yeah. That's wow. That's powerful. That's powerful. And in the book, you mentioned a lot, and in the beginning of this conversation, uh, you kind of led with this, and I think it's something that I really want the people watching to understand, because to be honest, like before I read the book, I didn't even really have a concept or understanding that this was a thing. But you
Mhm.
stated that Black studies requires a paradigm that is either interdisciplinary or even non-disciplinary.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by this and why traditional disciplinary boundaries might limit the potential of Black studies?
Because we're in Ngugi wa Thiong'o, God rest his soul, who just became an
Yes, rest
ancestor
in power. Yep.
last week. His book, Something Torn and New,
Hmm.
among many other books, he says that we are on a grand quest for wholeness.
Mm.
We have been dismembered.
Mm.
People from people,
Hmm.
people from land,
Mm.
and people from memory.
Wow.
We have been dismembered. And so what I'm saying is that a disciplinary approach doesn't come close to addressing the question of our dismemberment.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so we need to be able to have a holistic understanding of all the things that we need in order to put ourselves back together. And usually that requires us to read widely,
Hmm.
engage the world widely, read beyond our narrow confines geographically, think about the world on African terms, and many other things that I can't think of right now that we
Hmm.
need to do in order to make this happen.
Hmm.
But the notion of being trained narrowly in just one thing, one set of years, one set of problems, one set of, you know, locations, that's gone. It has to
Yeah.
be
Right.
for us to be free,
Right.
right? Or for us to link our study to freedom.
Hmm. What Du Bois, one of the people that you write about in the book,
Hmm.
obviously such a amazing and important figure within our history and intellectual traditions. But for people who are outside of the academy,
Hmm.
outside of Black studies, how is Du Bois usually engaged?
Yeah. It depends on where you are.
Hmm.
So the newest fad that I didn't get a chance to write about because it was so new
Hmm.
is people are obsessed with his data portraits.
Hmm.
I'm sure you've seen the images of him from the 1900 Paris Exposition. I write about it super briefly, but he has these really beautiful like forms of representing knowledge. You know, of what he believed was objective knowledge about the Black condition, and we can quibble with the concept of objectivity, but at that point in his life, he believed that the facts were the most important consideration.
Hmm.
And he said, here's how we're going to uniquely present the facts. And he wins all of these awards and all of the things happen to him. It's like, oh, he's a great social scientist. All the white social scientists start to come to him and say, we need your studies, we need your books, and all these other things. And then he sees Sam Hoses, a victim of a lynch mob.
Hmm.
He sees his body parts in a window being sold at a grocery store.
Hmm.
And he says, I'm not sure we can convince people with facts.
Right. Right.
Facts alone,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
we're living in that moment in 2025 where facts literally don't matter to people who are
Fact.
intent
Yeah,
on
yeah,
maintaining and perpetuating a fascist order. And that's where
absolutely.
Black studies is such a threat.
Hmm.
And so Du Bois then goes from there and says, look, I'm still going to do the scientific study, but I'm also going to do beyond science. I'm going to think beyond science. I'm going to think beyond what science can do. And the new fad is to kind of leave him where he was before he saw the knuckles,
Hmm.
right? Sam Hose's knuckles. That's the body part that he saw,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
And so they kind of leave him in Philadelphia Negro. They leave him in Paris Exposition 1900. They leave him in a place of being the pioneer of things that he
Hmm.
ultimately never works on beyond being the
Hmm.
pioneer,
Hmm.
at least not for an extended period of time.
Hmm.
And one way of like understanding is like this is a diversity project for people that want to do that kind of work. Another way of understanding it is if we could segment Du Bois, I don't have to confront the political beliefs
Right. Right.
that really animates all of this.
Yes. Right. Right.
And so I don't have to be a Pan-Africanist. I can just be deal with his
Hmm.
urban sociology.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
But for Du Bois, these things went together.
Mm. Right.
And
Right.
so that's my irritation, and that's why I think that the way that the academy kind of sees them is really problematic is because we don't have the wherewithal sometimes to understand the range
Hmm.
and to also see ourselves as being capable of that same kind of range.
Yeah.
Like too often the attitude of that's not my area becomes a way of disregarding.
Hmm.
I don't have to read that. That's not my area.
You,
My,
you
my
know,
area. And so this yeah. Go ahead.
no, you just made me think. All right, so like whenever figures like Dr. King, Malcolm, um, Fred Hampton, a lot of in America has this obsession and probably need, right, in order to maintain the status quo,
Hmm.
to sanitize our intellectual giants, divorce them of
Yeah.
their politics.
Yeah.
Um, and so, again, is this something that happens
That happened
often?
to it happened to the boys for
Hmm.
sure.
Hmm.
In fact, I gesture to this maybe in a couple lines in the book. My Du Bois teacher was Anthony Montero out of Philadelphia,
Hmm.
who's equal parts academician and street scholar,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, he makes the argument, I think it's a really strong argument, that Du Bois only became safe for academics after 1989,
Wow. Yes,
right?
I do remember you mentioning that. Yes.
And so the Soviet Union's collapse allows for Du Bois to be
Mm.
liberalized,
Hmm.
right? Because you have to remember before that, only people that talked about Du Bois were Black nationalists and Marxists,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And even if they're talking about them and they're not Black nationalists and Marxists, they're only reading Souls of Black Folk and one essay in Souls of Black Folks, the first essay,
Right. Right.
right? So that's the Du Bois that is akin to MLK's I Have a Dream or akin to Malcolm X's By Any Means Necessary. You just want to create just a little bit of a connection because we can't fully ignore, but we can't really deal with Black Reconstruction in America. Why would you give high schoolers a 727-page book? That's too much.
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
But
Right.
what I've realized
Mhm.
is it's not too much. It's
No.
absolutely necessary.
Hmm.
However long it takes,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because if you give high schoolers that book, they're going to go out into the world with a comprehension of U.S. history that far outstrips 99% of the people that they will encounter.
Absolutely.
This is a
Absolutely.
weapon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Yeah. No,
that's
absolutely.
that's the danger of it, right? And so
Hmm.
there's a group out in Philadelphia called the Abolition School. That's what they
Hmm.
do. They teach Black Reconstruction all over the city.
Wow, really? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such an important
Uh-huh.
work. I have it up there somewhere, but you're right.
Hmm.
Like for people that again, like you kind of mentioned, people will say, books like that are, hey, that's too much for, a high school student, or even that's too much for the average person who might not have gone to
Yeah.
college or at
Yeah.
least their major was, something else. But again, as you stated, these are weapons. These are important text for us
Yeah.
to understand our history, our present, evolution in thought, ideas, concepts. Because again, as you know, Du Bois was really big about us being people of ideas, right? And
Yeah.
with
Some of our most vulnerable people are the most hungry too. And I think
mm,
the people that are saying the too much don't have a conversation with those folks enough.
right,
Because if it's not too much for folks that's locked up, how is it too much for you?
mm, mm,
Because the
right,
demand from them is give us the books.
hmm
My friend Orsami Burton is at
yeah.
the
Shout
core
out
of
to Or,
this,
yeah,
right?
tip of the spear,
All Black study is in the prisons.
hmm hmm
It's in prisons in a way that is not in, you know, the academy in some respects, because there's a hunger there.
yeah,
We get constant mail from folks in the inside. And the last brother, he's out in, I guess he's New Mexico, Arizona, somewhere out there. And he's like, I'm trying to build a library, brother. Help me.
mm, mm,
So there's that hunger tells me something that if our most vulnerable people are turning to the word, that there's something about the word that matters.
yes,
And I will never give up or give in or lose hope in the ability of folks to quote unquote get it.
hmm
Because if the hunger is there, then
hmm
you can get it.
absolutely. One of my favorite parts of autobiography of Malcolm X
Yeah.
is not necessarily I mean, don't get me wrong, I love everybody, we're all, the story is us. We all, we love Malcolm. But the part that always kind of makes my imagination go is just, when he talks about being in prison and he's over there reading Spinoza and Hegel and all types of stuff, right? And it's
Yeah.
just like, and then the quotes that he has about, if he could, it's just be around books for the rest of his life and spend all his
Hmm.
days reading, um,
Yeah.
how do even if we look in, at the 60s in certain,
Hmm.
Black radical traditions,
Hmm.
reading and engaging text, understanding theory was extremely important to be
Hmm.
engaged in a lot of these movements, right? Um, is you kind of mentioned before, like, whether it's Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, or Marxism, different forms of leftist thought, socialism. Within Black studies, how I know that you were speaking about the sister before is kind of trying to make it uniform, where not necessarily we're promoting
Yeah.
one ideology, but this is
Right.
what you're going to get. But whenever
Yeah.
we look at things like Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, Marxism, socialism, how is how is that engaged within Black studies?
Yeah. I would say that um, the way that I kind of think about it is like this is kind of a crude categorization, but you have Marxists that come out of organizing traditions, and you have nationalists that come out of organizing traditions that then turn to the academy,
Hmm
right?
hmm
Most of those folks came of age 60s, 70s. They
hmm
are now entering their 80s.
hmm
Um, a lot of them still teach, right? A lot of them still train students.
hmm
But you also have academic Marxists,
hmm
right? And an academic Marxist is someone who's no less committed to anti-capitalist thought, but they don't necessarily have the organizing background that would then say, all right, what do you do next besides talk
hmm
about
Right,
anti-capitalism in a text,
right.
which is necessary. We all do so, right?
hmm
And so if you juxtapose those two traditions, right, there's a lot of debate about like organizing, there's a lot of debate about like, what's happening in the world. And a lot of times it does translate into action.
hmm
A lot of the action that we saw on campuses across the country was actually a result of this,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You take Ruha Benjamin's stance at Princeton, for instance. She was teaching that in class. And so they went
hmm
outside the class and
hmm
they looked and said, all right, most of the kids that got in trouble were
hmm
African American studies majors,
Wow,
right?
wow.
So that's happening. I
hmm
will never say that that's not happening, but I will also make an argument about the cowardice that also exists,
mm, mm,
and that
mhm.
showed up too.
Yeah,
A lot of people protected their careers.
yeah.
A lot of people protected their status,
Mhm,
even as they would teach these traditions, right?
mhm, mhm.
And so we have both ends within Black studies right now. In terms of nationalism, you will be hard pressed to find um, a lot of Black studies people that would say I'm a nationalist, only because it's a complicated term now. It's been complicated. But because of the history of the debates in the 1970s, someone like Amir Baraka, for instance, and even coming into the world of Farrakhan and so on and so forth, right?
Mhm, mhm,
A lot of people kind of go away from that term.
mhm,
Um, I believe in cultural nationalism to the extent that culture becomes the way to define the nature or the sensibility or the commonality that exists within what we might call Black people.
yes,
I think that's a valuable orienting frame.
I do too.
And I am absolutely aligned with the way that Sterling Stuckey, for instance, writes about the nationalist tradition,
Absolutely.
right? I'm also a Pan-Africanist in the sense that I don't believe in borders in the way that, borders are erected around quote unquote the modern world. We have to figure out what it means for African people to understand our commonality across the landscape wherever we are. And I found that being a Pan-Africanist is not only a challenge politically, it's a possibility. It's an opportunity to broaden our horizons that
Mhm,
then helps us write better. It helps us
mhm,
teach better. It helps us engage the questions that we are forced to contend with better,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
I mean, how might we read whatever the phenomenon of Kamala Harris was through a Pan-Africanist frame,
Right.
right? But the easy question was to say, well, she's not black or she's a crop, right? That was the easy thing,
Mm,
right? And so Pan-Africanism, allows us to really ask different questions. And I, politically, I believe that some form of African self-determination is going to be the future. I don't know that self-determination is going to be in the form of any kind of state. In fact,
mhm,
that's probably my next book or a book after the next book.
mhm,
What does it mean to think liberation will occur through a state form?
mm.
But I do think that some form of commonality, some form of togetherness is going to be necessary for peoples of African descent. I just don't see how we can be okay otherwise.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I had a uh, interview with Dr. Kalita Fairfax at Norfolk State.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one thing in our interview that she said that always stuck with me was she felt and she talked about as far as HBCUs go,
Hmm.
um, that they don't just owe something to the students, but she feels like at one part where she feels like HBUs could do better is being for the whole entire community. Um,
Hmm.
and then with that said, there are obviously liberation. When we talk about liberation for African people,
Hmm.
we're talking about liberation for African people. We're not making any distinctions of who has a degree in Black studies and who hasn't, right?
Right.
We But do you think it's possible for people outside of formal college institutions uh, in 2025 to meaningfully engage in Black studies? And if so, how might they approach or participate uh,
Yeah.
in this field? Because I mean, we spent
Hmm.
a lot of time talking about reading. We talked about brothers and sisters in prison who are doing the
Hmm.
knowledge and have
Hmm.
a great grasp and understanding of our history, culture, and politics.
Yeah.
But like, what advice would you give, people who might not, have any intentions on going to
Hmm.
college, but they want to understand more about our history, politics, and political struggle?
Yeah, they're watching this, hit me up. That's number one.
Yeah.
But like seriously, like the idea that we should be like engaged with people all the time. Like we were in Brooklyn,
Hmm.
Badur and I were in Brooklyn on May 8th, and we had almost standing room only at the Word Exchange. But the Word Exchange is next door to Bedvine Brew, which closed a couple of days ago. It's a big like spot in on Tompkins.
Hmm.
And these brothers who were from the community, from the neighborhood, they were going to the party next door,
Hmm.
right? But they saw us and they said, "What's going on in here?"
Hmm.
They interrupted us and said,
Hmm.
"What's going on in here?" And we said, "Let's come on in."
Hmm.
And they decided to stay. They sat on the floor for the next hour and a half
Wow. That's dope. That's dope.
and listened,
Hmm.
asked questions when they needed to, interjected when they needed to. But this idea that we are up here and
Hmm.
no, we're all
Hmm.
together. And the reality was that was a test of the space,
Hmm.
right? Because if we had been having an up here conversation, those brothers would not have stayed or even probably noticed
Yeah.
what was happening.
Right. Right.
So there's a way that you can model that. I think it was modeled for me. That's why I can do it.
Hmm.
But that's what we have to do. We have to be available. We have to be open. And if we are building the spaces, if we're creating spaces like you have on your show, then that's a huge first step,
Hmm.
right? And so you know, if you were a podcast host from Yale, I probably would have said no.
Right.
But I can't say no to you. The reason I can't say no because my political sensibilities require me to be with folks
Mm.
who are not necessarily oriented or associated,
Hmm.
right,
Hmm.
with spaces that are hierarchical.
Yeah.
And I'll give you just one more example of this. I wasn't always a fan, I'm still not a fan of like virtual and Zoom technology and all this stuff, but we were forced into it,
Yeah.
5 years ago. And I think one things that we have to remember is we can't underestimate how many people are at HBCUs who are so intimately connected to the people that we call the masses, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
just one degree of separation, probably no degree of separation for some people at Norfolk State,
Yeah.
right? These
Yeah.
are the masses.
Right. Right. Right.
And
Right.
what happened, so what happened was most people are at home for us at Howard,
Hmm.
which meant that lower income folks probably don't get privacy to go to
Hmm.
class,
Right.
as
Right.
much privacy. I got to
Hmm.
share a room, or I got to share this living room, or my sister has the office space, so I got to be in my bedroom, and my mom's going to come knock on the door. So please forgive me if you get an interruption. That was a beautiful moment for us. Why?
Hmm.
Because mom could hear the lecture
Right. Right.
and not
Right.
only know what she was paying for, or maybe not paying, but the idea was we're now educating whole families.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It
Yes.
wasn't just one student. It was a
Yes.
beautiful moment. I had so many parents just hang out,
Wow.
not out of boredom, not out of concern, but that's what y'all learning.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
At one point, a mother joined the class surreptitiously. She came to every lecture,
That is dope.
and we had to like introduce her at the end of the course.
Mhm.
Like, oh, she's been here the whole time. And so, as much as technology is not ours, and as much as it is, they can turn it off anytime they want. Right now, we can do things with it.
Yeah.
And I think that that is, lengthening our battlefield, lengthening our troops. We're getting more troops because, more of us are in spaces like this. More of us are hearing other things, but also, like I said, with the brothers in Brooklyn, this is our test
Hmm.
because if we get them in and they walk out of the door, that means we're not doing the work.
Right. 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 Man,
Because
that's
it's also very much reciprocal because they're bringing stuff. They're not just here. They're not just empty receptacles. No, they're bringing stuff, and I need to be able to understand what they bring. It's a mutual thing.
yes. Yes, absolutely. And nah, that just the I and just hearing about the mother who ended up
Yeah.
like that's dope, man. That's extremely dope. And so Dr. Myers, I definitely appreciate your time and you coming through. And there's one last question I wanted to ask you because it's something that hit the news recently. And when I first saw
Hmm.
it, I was really kind of thrown for a loop.
Yeah.
But given the recent appointment of Marva Johnson, a telecom executive
Oh God.
with close ties to Ron DeSantis,
Yeah.
right? No prior experience in higher education. She's now FAMU's president. Um, Obviously, there's concern with students, alumni, and faculty, and I guess the potential political influence on the university's direction. But
Yeah.
since we're, talking about Black studies in general,
Hmm.
um, is this something that you see could possibly be a trend going like
Oh yeah.
with other HBCUs, and how would that obviously affect Black studies programs at these colleges?
Yeah. So Darius Young down at FAMU, shout out to him, is building a I believe he's building a Black Studies program if it's not already built,
Hmm.
which is a crazy thing to say in Florida because a lot of folks lost their jobs at other HBCUs. Like I was just talking to a comrade last week who lost his job at an HBCU in Florida because he's teaching this, right?
Wow. Right.
And so it's a very courageous thing to say we're going to build a Black Studies program at FAMU.
Hmm.
At the same or alongside that, my contention is that they are Ron DeSantis and them are overplaying their hands
Mm, mm, hmm.
because there are enough forces in the HBCU world that are counter revolutionary that
Hmm.
they could have did this without the fanfare.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
What this
yeah.
does by them
Hmm.
overplaying their hand,
Hmm.
it gives people who might not have noticed this
Hmm.
an opportunity to resist it differently. And so they don't need me to tell them this because the Rattlers,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
they're going to strike.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
FAMU should be ungovernable
Mm, right,
next fall.
right.
It
Facts.
should be ungovernable. And, I think about the power of the football team. I think about the power of the Marching 100 band. I think about all these things that they need in order to, like,
Hmm.
that place should be ungovernable
Yep.
because this
Yep.
can't stand.
No.
You can't do this in our face. You really
Right,
shouldn't be doing
right.
it at all, but you can't do this in our face.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, yeah.
Right, right. Nah, that's real. That's real. Because when I first saw it, I was like, yo, like, how does this even happen? But yeah, you're right. Fam, you should be ungovernable. And as soon as I saw the news, I also saw a lot of FAMU alumni on social media that said, "Oh yeah, we about to get to work." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're about to fight this. But Dr. Myers, again, thank you
Yeah.
for your time. I appreciate your works. I'm gonna read the Cedric Robinson joint next.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
please.
but everybody go out and definitely, if you enjoyed this conversation, get Of Black Study, Joshua Myers. It's a great book. You'll more than likely you probably know about Du Bois, but it's approached much differently, and you'll probably learn about Sylvia Wynter if you don't already know about her. But either way, get the book, engage with the book. It's definitely one of those ones. So we appreciate your time and thank you for coming through, Dr. Myers.
All right. Appreciate you, brother.
No problem.